All right, here we go again. I've got all the cameras going, and I've got my wireless microphones hooked back up, and my fancy camera has a microphone on it. I'm about to capture every sound in this video 3 times over. Anyway, I am cleaning up the kitchen, and I'm coming to talk to y'all about Biopics. And that seems like a fun thing to talk about right now. I, generally speaking, do not watch biopics. If I'm gonna watch a movie that advertises itself as being accurate or telling the story of, I would just as soon watch the documentary about said subject, and use that as the defining reality for that subject. I'm a huge music fan. I love music, but I do not watch music documentaries for that very reason. I watch music documentaries. I do not watch music biopics. And like that's been a big thing here lately, is to create these biopics for these larger than life musicians that have been in the game for decades and made impactful songs and all that stuff. And what it does is it invites a bunch of phonies to watch the movie and then present themselves as though they are now experts in the topic of whatever it is they just watched a movie on, when in reality they're just a great big old phony who never cared that much about the topic to begin with, but now that they've watched the movie, they all of a sudden know everything about all these people. And which wouldn't necessarily be the biggest issue in the world if there wasn't the problem with the fact that these movies are not historically accurate. And so that's the big thing that I'm looking to tackle here. And it's not to take shots against the movies. Like, I get it, to a degree they cannot be historically accurate. Like, the story that is reality is not always going to transfer over nicely into a movie format. So you have to trim the fat, you have to trim up the story in order to make it movie friendly. But like, the whole world watches these movies and then takes them as gospel. And I think that's the issue that it creates. Because like, more often than not, these movies appeal to a crowd that is larger than the original crowd that the story appealed to. And so now you just have, like I said, a bunch of phonies running around who really don't know anything about the subject, claiming to be experts in the subject. And it's just irritating. And it is kind of the reason why gatekeeping exists. Like, I would give the argument that gatekeeping exists in this modern world because of issues like this, where you have something hit the mainstream and then you have to deal with all these people who are now all of a sudden like, oh my gosh, I know everything about this subject. So I watched the Iron Claw biopic yesterday. And the Iron Claw biopic, if you're not familiar, is a wrestling story that tells the story of the Von Erichs family, which is like one of the biggest wrestling tragedies in modern history. And so it's a movie dedicated to that family and their contributions to the wrestling world, and it gives their story. And I really like the studio that makes it. A24 seems like a really cool studio. They've got a lot of cool videos out, and they make a lot of good content. And then, of course, the actors that are involved. I really enjoy Zac Efron. I think he's got a lot of good content. And there's a guy from Shameless in that movie. He seems pretty legit as well. And so, like, they had a strong talent roster. They had a strong studio behind them. And they had an interesting concept. And so I was like, you know, despite my better judgment, I will give this a try. And give it a try, I most certainly did. And like, as a film, my only criticism of it as a film would be in its pacing, in that it is very difficult to get any concept of time while watching the movie. And more often than not, I felt like the events were just happening kind of one after the other. It was just like, boom, this happened, boom, this happened, boom, this happened, boom, this happened. And like a lot of people probably don't observe movies under the same lens that I do, because I'm a fiction writer and I write stories and that's what I do. I see these sorts of things when I watch films or whatever. But so that was my biggest criticism of it, like as a film, is I feel like it could have done better with some date stamps to tell you kind of like, it is X date now, it is X date now. And so you kind of have a better idea of where you are in terms of the time frame and what's going on. Because with that, you kind of get the feeling like all these horrible traumatic events happen over the span of just like a couple months, and like that is most certainly not the case. And like they do make efforts to make it seem as though time has passed. They have a lot of like younger characters that they show like more grown up in order to show time has passed. But I feel like it needed some better refining there. And especially as like someone who actually was familiar with the lore, the original lore, you know that all these things didn't happen like bang, 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 one after the other. But that's kind of the way that they made it feel. And so, once again, like I said, as a film, that's my biggest criticism, is it just felt like the pacing needed some help. Like, you guys got, I don't know how long of a movie it was. We're going to say an hour and a half, if not longer. But it's like you had an hour and a half to tell this story. And there's a lot of story to tell. There's a lot to cover. And I get that too. And I just feel like we could have made a bit more of an effort to be like, okay, let's slow down this pacing some. Let's focus on what's going on. And let's let the audience know that these poor people did not experience tragedy after tragedy after tragedy back to back like that. And it probably felt like that in the moment, I'm sure, because like most people don't experience that kind of tragedy back to back like that. But it's just interesting to me to see that and to kind of like watch it and be like, yeah, this feels a little rushed. But aside from that, like the camera work was really interesting. They did some really interesting work with the cameras. I was really, really hoping that they would have like shot a match and given us, like, I get it, you can't put like a full 20-minute match in a movie where you're only getting like an hour and a half. And like that's where the whole thing of like telling a story from a movie perspective is different than telling a story in a wrestling match or than telling a story in a book, in that you have to really make use of every second that you get. But it would have been cool to just see the guys run a match. And like I said, maybe not a full 20-minute match, but at least longer than what we got. And so that was my disappointment there. But like the performances, I feel like all the actors did a very good job with their performances. They did awesome doing what they did. And so like I've already said, I really like Zac Efron. He's good. And the guy from Shameless seems pretty legit as well. And so I think that the film was good in that way. And like the story that the film told was a good story. It's just because the story that the film told is also advertised as like a true story, then that's when you run into the issues that I have. And so, and it makes sense. I talked about my biggest rub being the passage of time and how I don't feel they did a great job at reflecting that. And I feel like it makes sense when you look at the actual story, why they had to kind of condense it all like that. And so I was mildly familiar with the Von Erichs family. They were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2009, and I've been pretty much like a lifelong fan of the WWE. And so when they got inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2009, I had no idea who they were. And I was like, hey, these people are being inducted into the Hall of Fame, and I have no idea who they are. And so I went ahead and took the time to do the research and figure out who these people were. And so I was loosely familiar with their story, because obviously 2009 is over 10 years ago. So if I was an expert on the matter back in 2009, safe to say I've forgotten a couple things since then. But at any rate, I was at least loosely familiar with their story going into the movie. I purposely didn't watch anything about their story going into the movie because I wanted the movie to still be somewhat of a surprise. But I, of course, refreshed my memory on the details of it after having watched the movie. And like a lot of these events, so like Kerry Von Erich's, this is a spoiler alert. I was trying to avoid spoilers, and but I will try and like tiptoe around it. But like the incident that happens with him is advertised on the movie almost as though it's like the same night that he won the championship, he went out and had his accident, when in reality the accident was like a year later than when he had won the championship. He won the championship in light of David's tragedy, and then he turned it back over to Ric Flair like 14 days later. It was a very short-lived title run, and it was mostly a title run out of sympathy. And so they advertised it as though he kind of squandered his title shot, which really kind of makes Kerry look not great. And so the timing there wasn't quite right. The timing with Mike was not right either, although I feel like Mike's story, despite the fact that it was condensed, I feel like his story was probably the one that I liked the most. And like I click with any story about brothers, and like as a brother myself, that always is a big deal for me if there's a movie that I'm watching about brothers. And so, and as Mike being the youngest in the movie, I clicked with that situation immediately as well. And so I feel like they did the best job with his character and showing the brothers kind of sticking up for him and being good older brothers to him. And so I feel like they did a really good job with that. It's just the timeline was messed up, but it's like in the instance of Mike's story, does the messed up timeline affect his character? And for me, the answer is no. I think the timeline, if anything, enhances his character in the film, and so that's why I think that timeline was fine. The problem with them shortening Kerry's timeline is it damages Kerry's character. And so it's like, unless they were wanting to create a character that seemed reckless and willing to throw this all away, they really should have reconsidered how they advertised that timeline in the film. And then there's the complete omission of Chris Von Erich. And Chris Von Erich, I can get, once again, I understand why they did not include him, because his story is very close to Kerry's story. And they kind of in the film combined the two anyway, because in the original tragedy, Kevin discovers Chris. And well, it's kind of like they combined like 3 different stories with that one. Because Kevin discovers Chris in the original story, and he does not discover Kerry. The dad discovers Kerry. And but Kevin also tells the story about Mike when he was rushed to the hospital. He grabbed him and put him over his shoulder and rushed into the hospital. And so the idea is like they're kind of combining all of those stories into one with Carrie. And again, like creatively, I understand why they didn't include Chris, because of the idea that their stories were so similar that it feels like an uncreative addition to the story, even though like you're keeping it in there to stay accurate to the lore. And so that's the interesting part there, is observing the differences that they made, understanding why they made them, and then determining if the differences were a hindrance or a help to the story. Like I said, with Mike's story, I definitely felt like was the strongest of the stories that they told, despite the modifications. I feel like his story was told very well. You immediately knew where they were going with his story. And if you knew the lore, like me, you knew the tragedy that you were about to experience. Because early on in the movie, like I said, they show the older brother sticking up for him. And then they show even Kevin Von Erich's character talking to the mom, saying that dad's too hard on him. And so, like, early on in the movie, you kind of get the setup that they're going for there. And then you get the tragic payoff of the event. And, like, the fact that, like, I can't talk enough about how well they did that story. Because it was like, we all knew and understood that Mike was not meant for the wrestling world. And we all knew and understood how much the brothers cared for him. And so then seeing his tragedy happen and unfold really kind of punches, and it packs a good story punch and has a lot of good impact there. And so, like I said, I really think that they did a wonderful job with that story. The Carrie story, like I said, they kind of made Carrie seem very reckless in his story with the timing adjustments that they made. And then I'm trying to think of some other. David was pretty standard. David, I don't know. He was probably the one that got the most time to like breathe as like an accurate depiction of what actually happened, because he was the first one. And so it's like once the first tragedy strikes, the film then has to alter its storytelling to keep the energy level going. And so even though you don't want it to be one after the other, bang, 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 everyone's dead, you also don't want it to be so slow that you bore your audience until the next impactful moment. And so that's why I think David's story had the most time to breathe and was the most accurate because of that. And then, of course, once his story hit, then the action kind of ramped up, and that's when you start seeing everything else kind of going down. Another weird inconsistency with the movie is the dad's role. Fritz Von Erich. Fritz is painted in a very negative light and as a very plain like villain of the movie. And this is a popular concept in like performance movies of the time and performance related material of the time, is they have these fathers who are so determined for their children to succeed that they throw away the success and the love of their own father or parenthood in order to accomplish that. That concept is frequently visited with Joe Jackson, Michael Jackson's dad, and I feel like there's another like famous father that people are like, that guy was ruthless and he shaped up his kids, but it was a terrible upbringing. And they very much so built Carrie Von Erich. Why do I keep saying Carrie? They very much so built Fritz Von Erich up in that light. And it makes me wonder if he was really like that or not. because I don't know how closely they worked with the Von Erich family on this film, but like I've followed the tragedy for a while, and it was never once presented as though Carrie Von Erich was this as though Fritz Von Erich was this ruthless parent who was just like gunning for the title shot and gunning for success at the expense of his children. And like there is a fine line between like a stern disciplinarian and a bad parent, and I feel like they cross that line on several occasions in this movie, and they like go out of their way to make this man a villain. But then like from Kevin's perspective, he never presents his father as a villain of his story. And so it just makes me wonder, it's like, did they work closely with Kevin, and the Fritz that we saw in the movie was the closest depiction we've had of a real life Fritz? Or did they kind of go off script because they felt that the villain needed they felt that the movie needed a villain, and so then they went off script and were like, well, we're going to turn this into one of those over obsessed with success dad father figures who turns crazy to get his kids success. And it's interesting because like I feel like a lot of times like from a child's perspective, you're blind to those sorts of things because you have a tendency to love your parents regardless of how terrible they might be. And so it's like, was that the reality of the situation that Kevin is only now coming to terms with as an older adult? Because I've only ever seen like documentaries of him from like 2009 or whatever when I was watching documentaries. It was just interesting to see that because, like I said, the movie or the situation had not been presented to me as though he was the villain of the story, but he was very much so the villain of the movie. And so it's an interesting angle, and it kind of plays off of the classic idea of like, does every story need to have a villain in that sense? To which I would say no. Like, the situation can be a villain even though it's not a character in the traditional sense. So you could have made it more about the Von Erichs fighting against the wrestling business to try and be recognized and respected as wrestlers who deserved a title shot or whatever it was they were going for. And like, although the brothers weren't, until probably closer to the end, although the brothers weren't directly conflicting with their father, like there was no doubt that the largest source of confrontation came from the dad in this movie. And so, like I said, it's just an interesting thing to observe and be like, okay, so was this like Kevin in hindsight being like, oh snap, this is what he did to us? Or is this the movie being like, we need a villain, let's make it Fritz? Because like the other thing is like Fritz played a villain character in his wrestling career days. He was one of the like gnarliest villains of like old like 1950s, 60s wrestling time. And he played a Nazi. That was his wrestling character. And so obviously there is the negative connotations that come with that, the fact that he was willing to play someone as abundantly evil as a Nazi in wrestling back in the 50s. And so it's like, are they trying to play off of his character in that regards and be like, he was the ultimate heel in the 50s, so we're going to make him the ultimate heel in this movie, but like at the sacrifice of his own image, so to speak? Because like no one's around now to say that he was or wasn't this terrible person except for Kevin, and Kevin's never, to my knowledge, displayed him as this terrible person. And so it's an interesting angle. Watching the biopic has inspired me to watch more documentaries about the Von Erichs tragedy in an effort to understand it completely so that when people are talking about the movie, I can either shut them down with facts or support them with facts, whatever it needs to be. And so that's been kind of the most interesting part about having watched the movies, that it's now inspired me to more see like what actually happened. But like I said, all in all, it wasn't like a bad movie. Like, I don't want people to think I'm throwing shade at the movie and I'm like, this movie's terrible. Like biopics in general, like I said, just aren't my scene, because I know that they are not inherently accurate, and like they can't be, because you can't tell a good story in a movie. And well, I shouldn't say you can't. It's more difficult to tell a good story in a movie and remain completely factually accurate at the same time. That is why movies more often than not take these sorts of creative liberties. And so part of me wishes that I had watched more about the Von Erichs before going into the movie, so I knew more about what I was expecting. Because like when I was watching it, I was like, I swear there was a fifth brother, and I'm not wrong in that matter, in that the fact that there was a Chris Von Erich and they had a fake brother, Lance Von Erich. And so I think what I was thinking when I was after I got home after the movie, I was like, I swear there was another brother. And so I looked them up and I found Chris, who was a biological brother, and I was like, I don't remember a Chris Von Erich, but I guess that's who I was thinking of. And then after some more digging, I found Lance, who was a fake brother that they put on television after David's death to try and kind of replace David. And it's funny, they had MJF play Lance Von Erich in the movie, and it's just this very like small snippet of a scene, and you would have to know who MJF is and who Lance Von Erich is to even remotely understand what's going on in that scene. Otherwise, it just seems like a scene where there's something sad going on to Kevin Von Erich's character. Which was also interesting to me, because I had walked in the movie expecting MJF to actually be like a character. And because like I remember looking it up and I was like, wow, he's playing one of the Von Erich brothers. Like, that's nutso gutso. And I was watching this movie looking for him and I was like, where is this guy at? He is nowhere to be seen. Well, that's because he played the fake brother and he was more of an active consultant to keep them accurate to the craft of wrestling and less of a actual actor, which I thought was going to be interesting, because I was like, it'd be interesting to see if this guy can actually act in a whole movie. Like, there is definitely a difference between being a dramatic actor and being a professional wrestler. Like, and that seems obvious to say, but like so many wrestlers have tried acting, and in some ways you are acting as a wrestler, but it's a different beast. Obviously wrestling is far more athletic than acting is for the most part. And so like when actors walk into the ring and experience that, they're like, oh, this is taxing and very much so an athletic thing to be doing. And then when wrestlers run into the acting realm, they're like, well, this isn't quite the same as cutting a promo. And so it's interesting to me to see those two career paths cross paths, because you get the wrestlers trying to go actor pretty frequently, because that tends to be like the next natural step in the wrestling progression. Like, you become a successful wrestler, you master that craft, and then you move into Hollywood and become an actor, and you do what that has to offer. That seems like the natural progression for like a successful wrestler to take. But you don't see very many actors stepping into the wrestling world. And so I have a lot of respect for Zac Efron and the guy from Shameless for doing that, because I think that's a huge thing for them to do. I think that's really cool that they did that. And so that kind of perspective that we got was really interesting. And I feel like I was going somewhere with that. I was trying to make it a whole full circle moment, but I lost track of what I was talking about. And now I don't know where I was going with that. But, seeing how MJF would have done as an actor if he was actually playing in the film, and which it doesn't necessarily make that much of a difference that he wasn't in it. But I still really feel like I was going somewhere else with that. But at any rate, my kitchen is about clean now. I've been talking to you guys for 35 minutes. That's not so bad. I thought it was a lot longer than 35 minutes. But kind of wrapping up and talking about, I don't intend to watch a whole bunch of biopics. I especially won't be watching them about the musicians and stuff, because I'm a huge music fan and I don't have any interest in watching these biopics about these musicians. The biggest thing that bothers me with the music ones is having to hear like other people sing these musicians' songs, and then all these people are like, oh my gosh, that guy sounded just like Johnny Cash, and I'm just like, please stop. And so yeah, I am not thrilled about the day that they finally do a Michael Jackson one, because then I'm gonna have to hear all these people tell me that they know everything about Michael Jackson because they went out and saw a movie one time, and that's annoying. So I don't know. All in all, it was a good film. It was a fun experience. I don't detour people from watching it, especially if you're not like a huge wrestling fan and you want like a good film about brotherly bonding and stuff like that. And if you're up for a good tragedy, then I would very much so encourage you to go and see the movie. Otherwise, if you're like me and you're a bit of a snob and you're like, I only watch it if it's super historically accurate, then you might be a little disappointed with what you find. But at the same time, like, anyone who knows anything should know better than to walk into a Hollywood film that's like reenacting real events and expect complete and total historical accuracy. And so, which I didn't. And it was, like I said, fun to observe it in a different light and to see it as it is. And so that's what I've got going on. It's already like coming out of theaters too, which is weird. I didn't think like A24 films were seen as like weird indie films, given like the big names that they've had and the big films that they've made. But like, it came into theaters December 22nd, and one of the theaters here in town has already stopped playing it. And I'm guessing that the other theater isn't going to be too far behind them. And I was like, dang, the thing was in theaters for a month. And then they said, bye. So, at any rate, it was a good time. It was a good film. I cleaned the house. Hopefully it was a good conversation. Hopefully we always have good conversations. I'll see you guys on the next one. Yo, so I remembered what I was going to talk about while I was sitting here editing this video, and I was like, oh, I remember the other point that I wanted to bring up when I was trying to circle back in this video. Sometimes I am an absolute airhead and cannot remember for the life of me what I'm trying to talk about, and then I go off on a tangent to like tell a story to explain where I'm going, and then I don't ever get back to where I was going. But essentially, I was talking about the transition from wrestler to actor and how that contrasts against the transition from actor to wrestler. And I was really fascinated by the person who played Ric Flair, in the fact that I thought he did an awful job. But like, trying to play Ric Flair obviously is a losing battle. Like, Ric Flair is such a unique man and a unique character that you just cannot play that guy and do it very successfully. But I did want to point it out as like a huge point to like
to be like, this is the kind of man that Ric Flair is. He is so larger than life that like even professionally trained actors have a very difficult time capturing the energy that he had and that he brought to the wrestling stage. And so I wanted to point that out as like a unique like props to Ric Flair. And like it's really cool to see that like someone in the wrestling environment who is exclusive to the wrestling environment can be such a larger than life character. And I thought that was really awesome. Even though, like I said, I didn't think the actor did a very good job portraying him at all, I think it spoke miles to the character that Ric Flair is and just how difficult it would be to be Ric Flair. With that said, like I also want to clarify, I did enjoy the movie. Like I liked the movie. I think I pointed that out enough while I was filming my critique, if you will. But I did want to say, like, the actors' performances were awesome. What they did with Mike's story was amazing and very, like, touching, and I felt that. And I did like the movie. I just, it's the culture behind biopics that I don't like and that I'm kind of, like, against. And that was kind of the main takeaway here. I'm actually going to shut off the camera this time. Thanks for your time.